Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about our post-truth present and our transhuman future, with the aim of sketching out the outlines of what awaits us in the years and the decades ahead of us. This podcast is brought to you by Rokos. Companies with limited IT budgets and personnel can now get the same cybersecurity protection as big enterprises. Rokos' Secure Access Service Edge, SASE solution, with zero trust, provides enterprise-grade comprehensive cybersecurity so that you can focus on your business. For more, please visit www.rokos.com. That's ROQOS.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.
Professor Salman Hameed, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Welcome to Humanity 8.0. I always laugh and chuckle when I say 8.0. And the reason why, and I like to remind folks why it's 8.0 is because I believe that the human being and humanity, as we know, it really changes fundamentally through innovations, right? So just starting from the example of where we didn't have shoes way back then, right? Just the introduction of shoes turned us into different human beings. And so today we're going to talk about the topic that, as I was telling you before we started recording, I didn't even know existed as such. I knew, of course, Star Trek and all that good stuff, but it was not something that I really thought about it in terms of, let me sit down and think through the implications of all these things and how real is it and how far are we from there and all that. So I want to delve into that topic, and what I want to do, and this has always been useful to me whenever I'm trying to grapple with something that is new, is I take a specific sort of example, right, and latch onto that and then see how I can go from there, something I can relate to. So the example I want to give, which is probably very modest compared to the thought that you have, the example of the moon, okay? I see the moon as the closest thing where we can start realizing some of the ideas that you propose. And I want to start with a simple question, which the more I thought about it, it turned out to be actually a complex question. At least it's simple to ask. And that is the following, right? If, let's say, the United States or China or one of the advanced countries, the United States developed technology that enabled us human beings, just the average person, to go to the moon affordably and safely, just as affordably and safely as taking a 20-hour trip on a plane. Nobody thinks twice really about it, right? It's safe, it's affordable enough. People do it all the time. Assume we are at that point, let's say 50 years from now. We are at that point. What do you think? What do you think if that becomes part of just a given, just like today when some people who are born in the 90s, Google is just a given, right? So is the internet. It's a given, right? They see it as a given. It's not something marvelous. But folks who, let's say, were born now, 50 years from now, they'll see it as folks who are born like a few years before the ability to go to the moon will see it as a given. How do you think that would change, number one, our relationship to the moon? The moon is a foreign thing. It inspires awe. It makes us think about, wow, the universe, right? What if it becomes a thing we can just go to over the weekend and come back? How would that change our perception of the moon and the universe and our place in the universe as well?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, in some sense, what you are asking is, I don't think, for better or for worse. So right now, we're not talking about should we do that and how should we do that and all of that stuff. So I'm not talking about that, right?
Not yet.
I think what you are right now laying out is something I think that's going to happen. I don't think that is something that is unreal, or you go like, okay, this is so far in the future that we cannot even imagine it. Right. Yeah. I don't think that is the case. I think your 50-year time frame probably is realistic in that sense. There are a couple of ways of thinking about it, I'm always sort of like, amazed at, for example, a cell phone, right? I mean, like, cell phone is, when it came out, like, I was sort of like, growing up, I was in grad school when when internet was really sort of like, taking shape. And we had those flip phones for a while, which was a technological marvel in the sense that you could actually take phone with you.
Yeah.
And now we have cell phone, right? Now, my son is growing up, he's 10. And for him, this is actually not something to think about.
At all.
This is just a tool that is there. It happens. And there are other things that are taking place and so on and so forth. Okay, can you check this? Like, what do you mean? Can you, do you know how amazing this is, right? So, I think so what you are, in some sense, and so this is an analogy, it's a slightly different because I'm talking about technology versus place. But I think novelty-wise, it would be something like that. I was just thinking about this notion that, so I'm originally from Pakistan, and to go there, you just take a flight and go there, and it can be annoying. It could sort of like, take a long time. It takes sort of like, whatever, 12 hours, 10 hours with a stop in between, and you go like, oh my goodness, I'm just tired of travel. But 100 years ago, people were taking a ship. That would have been the mode of transportation, right? So the way I would frame that would be that I think it is about human flexibility. We actually are quite malleable. We are quite flexible. We adapt very quickly to a new circumstance. So to me, would moon become another place? Yeah, it doesn't mean that it would, at least in my mind, that it would lose its awe in some ways, because you see the beautiful sunset. It's not that you haven't seen sunsets before, but you still can feel the awe. It can be a special place. I'm trained as an astronomer, so a while back, sort of like going to Hawaii. You go like, wow, that doesn't mean people haven't been to Hawaii. You cannot go to Hawaii, but it's still amazing. So I think that all park will be there. It will be accessible in that context. I think it would be really cool that you can actually go there. I would love to go, hey, I can take a 3-day trip to the moon, and you see sort of like, the curvature of the moon. That would be strange because it's relatively small. People talk about astronauts feeling weird about because of the curvature, the darkness, and all of that stuff.
And you see the Earth. When you see the Earth, it gives you perspective, I think.
That's exactly right. So I think it would be, people will adapt to it. It would be an amazing thing. But of course, who gets to go, meaning to say who can afford it, and so on and so forth. So there are these structural issues that they are still going to be there. But nevertheless, just purely from your question about, hey, what it would be, I think it would still awe-inspiring, and I think it would be really cool to go to the moon.
I agree. We can just point to like the Grand Canyon or things that are already here, right?
Yeah.
The fact that we could just go doesn't necessarily negate our ability to be awestruck by them. And I was thinking, as you were talking, because I didn't think about that before. When the moon, I can see the Earth. I think it's going to create an awe-inspiring situation that was not possible before, right? Perhaps it will make people reflect about how small they are, So anyway, wanted to start with that.
So if I can just add to that,
absolutely.
Because that particular thing that you are referring to is something that was in the 1980s that was written by, and I forgot the name of the author, the overview effect, that for astronauts who have seen the whole Earth, or at least even from space, not just the whole Earth, but sort of like Earth from space, it really changes them. And this person actually did all the interviews with the astronauts and things like that. So I think there is this element to it. Sorry, I cut you off before. So
no, I was not definitely. That's exactly, what I was thinking as well. So that's why I sort of negated, because let's go back to the issues of, I negated the issues of affordability, and access and convenience, so forth, just so that we can just zoom in on that particular point. Let's take a step back. I put in like 50 years. You know a lot more about what it takes to get to a point where it will be safe, it will be affordable, so that it becomes routine. How far do you think we are from that place?
You mean when it would be safe and
Yep.
a routine?
Yep, and affordable.
Well, I mean, okay. So right now, the current plans are that we are talking about going back to the moon in a
Yep.
couple of years. Oh, that's the American plan. The Chinese plan is like, within the next 8 to 10 years, within 10 years, definitely, probably China is going to be there. Their plans are both US, China, and if European Union and Russia that also get involved, they're all going to the South Pole. And so that's like within the next decade. And so first of all, I mean, and the reason why I've gotten really interested in this is because these are not, as we mentioned, these are not purely theoretical ideas far in the future. We are talking about the next 10 years or so, where there are going to be humans on the moon, or perhaps as a research station, or perhaps as a base, or however you do it. There are also plans of orbiting stations around the moon. So what kind of place moon is going to be? I mean, it's not going to be, it's relatively small. It is harsh. It's not a place where it's easy to live on. So it's not something that is going to be like, you have a thriving city over there where there is business and things like that. At least that's not what it looks like. So, I mean, I think 50 years is an optimistic scenario where it's going to become that some people can go. I mean, I don't know, maybe, and I'm just thinking on top of my head, maybe something like right now, these suborbital flights that some millionaires are doing. Okay, so you can do, I mean, I think I can see that, for example, in the next 2 decades, or maybe even less. So I think in 50 years, I see people going over there. They can take a trip to the moon. It also depends upon how cheap it gets to go from the launch to the moon, which will depend upon what are the plans of the major countries or space corporations to how they are planning on using the moon. So, for example, if they are using the moon as a launch pad for other places, which it looks like, then perhaps this first phase of going from the Earth to the moon may become actually relatively cheaper, because their main target is going to be to streamline that process and then to go from there.
Yep.
If that is the case, then I mean, it could get 50 years. If you have, I'm just making stuff up now, that if you have if you are sort of like, a reasonably wealthy person, you can actually go there. I think that would have access to that on the moon. And of course, there will be, I mean, there are in parallel, because there are other things that are likely to happen. People are talking about orbital hotels, for example, around here. So then, okay, so if you have orbital hotel, if you can spend X amount of money, why not go to the moon? What difference does that make? How much? I mean, so once you figure out these fundamental questions of sort of like, from here to the moon, if that goes smoothly, and I think a couple of decades, my guess would be that would become a smoother context. So, I mean, I think 40, 50 years, I can imagine people going there.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting really is that innovation is accelerating, right? So if we're thinking about, okay, what are the tools? If we had only the tools we had today, okay, it might take 50, 100 years. But maybe in 10 years, the tools will have evolved to a point where that shrinks. I don't know. I say this knowing that a lot of, coming from a field, so my field is human language technology, speech recognition, natural language, and all that. That took a much longer time to solve than we thought back in, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s, right? I think there we thought it was around the corner, but it took much longer time to get there. So, but then the thing is this, it was just basically static. And then at some point in 2012, when data arrived en masse, right? then there was a huge spike in terms of being able to do. Just opened up a whole, and then a lot of innovation happened very, very quickly.
Yeah.
But there was a long, I don't know what you can call it, not the tail, but long neck to get to that point. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about, okay, we know that there are some powers right now who have the resources to go to the moon and maybe create a settlement for whatever. Maybe they can do experiments there easier, whatever purpose. And maybe that's another question I'll ask you. But before I ask you that question, assume that you have China and you have the European Union and you have India, and then you have the United States, and they all have more or less the same capabilities to go and then and create a station there where they have staff, I don't know, 20 people they stay there in rotation, I don't know, a few months, and then they come back safely and all that. Assume that becomes possible. So my question to you is, are there today protocols about what can one do in the moon, and who owns, or is there an ownership concept there? Do you own it? And so forth. Let's just start with that sort of use case, if I want to call it that.
Well, I mean, that's the biggest question in some ways of who owns the moon. And this is so for really fascinating reasons, the only treaty in some ways for outer space that everybody signed on to was in 1967. This is the outer space treaty. And it's a pretty idealistic treaty. I think it's great. It was also sort of the 60s. I think the hippie aspect was also, the idealism was also there. But also Soviet Union and the United States at that time did come together. This is before Apollo and Apollo 11 landing. And the treaty explicitly says that no country, no nation can own any heavenly bodies, right? Okay. But it's also, and I think the reason why it got signed was because there is a lot of ambiguity in it. Then what? What does it mean, right? Same thing goes with that you cannot use it. You cannot have a sort of like nuclear tests on nuclear weapons in space. But it leaves the door open for, okay, so what else can you have, right? And so in some sense, outer space treaty is something that is right now hovering over everyone's head, but it's ambiguous enough that people are thinking that, okay, maybe there could be, not maybe, that there are workarounds to that.
Yeah.
And I think this is the reason why right now is a really important time to talk about these things, because the moon is the first place where these kind of conversations are going to take place. A precedence is going to be set. So once you are there, and once the precedence is set, so Mars is, okay, well, remember what we did on the moon, right? So the moon, in my mind, and again, a lot of people are working on it. There is space law is a whole field. People are working on these things. There are activists also that are working on these aspects. But in some ways, the moon will set the table of how human expansion or human settlements in space are going to be. And this question, for example, who owns the moon? Well, right now, it's unclear to a certain degree. And that is one of the reasons, for example, private individuals say, I can own it. I'm not a nation, right? I'm not violating outer space treaty. And in fact, that was one of those things. At that time, we joked about it or we laughed about it in the 1990s. There was somebody in California who was selling lunar plots, lunar land, because he says, I can sell it, right? He did have the sort of did make a couple of million from there. And it said, well, I told NASA, I sent my sort of letters to them. It's like, if there is a claim, let me know. Otherwise, it's mine, right? So that aside, now you are in a territory, as you just said, that other nations are planning on going. The US, the Artemis program, they just had a test run, sort of Artemis around it. And then it's expected probably in 2025 that you will have the first astronauts, American astronauts, back on the moon. So who owns it? Well, right now it's unclear. And remember, as I mentioned, sort of like from the Outer Space Treaty, even if you extract resources from the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, and it's a long time ago, 1967, right?
Different world, yeah.
In theory, your exploration has to be for peaceful purposes and for all mankind, for the benefit of all mankind. Right? Now, what does that mean? I mean, yes, but what it looks like right now, so again, so this is where it comes in that private corporations, so this is where that again, the loophole or looks like the private corporations are coming in and they're saying, well, again, so they are not nations, first of all, and they can extract resources. So these things are changing and are changing fast. One of the reasons is in 2015, President Obama at the time, he, I don't know if it was a law or not, but the language for that, but he allowed that if a corporation, for example, extracts resources from an asteroid, then the profit from those resources can be kept by the corporation, right? So it's not that they own the asteroid, but the extract from and the benefit from it they can actually do. Now, this was a significant departure, right? Because in Outer Space Treaty, there was this ambiguity, but because of President Obama's order, that actually, in some sense, that has also led to, in some sense, not an explosion, but certainly a lot of incentive for space companies to come in, because the same question goes now with the moon. Because, okay, so if we extract something and we take that extract, well, that is not owning the moon underneath it, but we have the extract. And just 2 years ago, to 2021, NASA actually officially, it's a symbolic move, but a really important one. They actually signed a contract with a company, space company, private company called Lunar Outpost. They gave them 10-cent check, and sort of like, so again, so there's a lot of PR component to that. 10-cent check for a future extraction of resources, and they said it's going to be $1. So the rest of the 90 cents they're going to give them once the Lunar Outpost extracts material from it. But the goal of it, I mean, of course, it's a symbolic thing, but the goal of it is to set a precedent. Of course, now they are doing it. They have signed up a contract. Now there are going to be, in some sense, this legal issues, whether that fits in with the Outer Space Treaty or not. Can it be done or not? And once it gets settled that, yeah, you can, I think then this kind of private extraction and stuff like that becomes the norm. And so it's I mean, in some sense, pace of these things, as the contract has already been signed, for example, in 2021 and these type of things, and you don't hear as much about, wait a minute, this is a pretty big thing. Like, that once you overturn or once you sidestep Outer Space Treaty, well, that is the context, more likely than not, that is going to get used now from the future, right? I mean, like, not just on the moon, but Mars and stuff like that. So I personally think that's a really big thing. And that's one of the reasons I'm talking to you as well, because I think the significance of that, both for humans and for what kind of values we are going to take into space, I think that calls into question.
So the 1967 treaty, if somebody violates that treaty, what court does one go to if there's such a thing?
Well, it's a United Nations treaty.
It's United Nations treaty. Okay.
But United Nations, it's a United Nations treaty. So, I mean, in theory, you can you
does
have
it have
these...
teeth? Does it have teeth? Like, does it prevent people from doing, or is it just a involuntary?
No. Well,
not.
It's not. I mean, it's binding in some sense, but the question is, what do you do if you bypass it in these type of things, right? I mean, so it has enough
ambiguity.
And again, this is, so I'm not a space lawyer, but what I can imagine, the way reason these things are happening is that it has enough teeth that countries are not as yet openly violating it. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, because then you can go to the UN, you can go to the UN Security Council, whatever, and you can say, look, it's a clear violation. So somebody, if a country goes right now to the moon and says, okay, this moon is ours. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a pretty swift backlash to that. And one of the ways of that backlash is going to be it's illegal because there is a treaty.
Yeah.
Right. So that would look like a teeth. But other than that, this type of thing, and that's why I think this private national, private public, in some sense, marriage can be really convenient. To exploit the ambiguities in the outer space treaty.
Yeah, when it just feels like the private, like the example you gave, where NASA under I don't know what authority decided to strike a deal with a private company, and then that private company is not bound. It's not a nation, so not bound by the 1967 treaty, right? So they can do their thing. Let's take the example of, let's say, the United States establishes a base there, right? A physical thing, right? With perimeter and all that, right? Now it owns that property, obviously, right? And how
well, no, not according to outer space treaty, right? I mean, you cannot own a piece of land, and so
it's not the land. It's not the land. It is the building. And the stuff inside of it, and then the IP that you develop in that building, right? So I think that's what you're saying about the ambiguity, right? It becomes like, okay, so I build this base. Of course, I have to build it on top of land. Do I need to get permission to build the base? I don't think the United States is going to ask for permission, and we know how they behave. And if they create a precedent of, I'm going not to violate this. No, I'm not going to own. I don't say I own the moon. I don't even say I own the land. I can just say I own my buildings and my staff and everything. That's my equipment. That's mine. Obviously, yes. And then China says, okay, well, let me do the same thing, right? So let me ask you if you think because if we think of the moon as being just an extension of the Earth, right? Except that the moon doesn't have people, right? Back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, when colonization was in full swing, all these countries, they went to those places always in the name of humanity, of doing something good for humanity, whether it's Christians or Muslims. Way before, they didn't go there and say, we want to extract resources from you. They went there, at least at the facade level, right? We are here to advance humanity, progress, introduce these savages to the Lord and so forth, right? The churches and so on, right? So it feels like to me like, okay, we're going to go there, we're going to benefit humanity. It sounds familiar to colonization, back, imperialism, where you went to, except that here, conveniently, there are no human beings, right? So it becomes a pure race for land, let's say, and if, let's say, at some point in the next few years we discover that there is a mineral that exists only in the moon that will allow you to do something amazing, right? Let's think about that situation, right? So land, nobody's there. Nobody is going to claim that all of it is theirs. They install some bases there. They don't claim that the land is theirs, but all of a sudden you have facts on the ground, right? And you have real competition for something concrete that has implications on the people on the Earth. So in that situation, do you think that becomes a completely new sort of reality we have to deal with, where the moon is felt to be an extension of the Earth and first come, first serve? How do you think, if we get to that point, which I think is very possible, maybe likely, I don't know if likely, but it's at least possible. What do you think? I threw a lot of things.
Yeah, there are a lot of things. So let me go through a few of them.
Sure.
And one is actually, so first of all, it's interesting, right? I mean, we talk about space colonization, right? So we're already talking about colonization, which is sort of like,
right, exactly.
The second thing is British East India Company. So oftentimes people think about the model that people use is North America, where the Europeans came in and displaced the indigenous population, and certainly that is actually a pretty good warning and a pretty good way of thinking about it. The way the population thought that, well, this land is ours, and even though there were people there, actually they didn't consider them to be equals. They didn't consider them to be humans in that same level, and they said, oh yeah, of course we can take it because we have manifest destiny, right? I mean, so that is the way we had. So in some sense that is likely, but what I would like to point out is that in South Asia, the British East India Company explicitly came for trading purposes. So they actually didn't come for civilizational messages initially, right? And that was a private corporation, and it had the sort of like backing of the British Empire, but overall it was seeking sort of like trade, and then it had its own armies, and it was even more powerful, sort of like in many ways than the British armies, and so on and so forth, right?
But they came for sorry to interrupt, but they came for trading, right? So they framed it as we're going to trade, as opposed to we're going to take the land. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that is something, but the motive, and so that goes to the bigger critique of capitalism, right? I mean, in that context. Okay, so here you will have, I mean, obviously no people there, but I think the context of exploitation of resources, I think that may very well, and this is again, and I should parenthesize it, unfortunately, that may very well take place in the same way as an extension. So as you are saying, moon is the extension of the earth, and so are going to be the with the private corporations, with governments and all of that stuff. This kind of exploitation, unfortunately for resources, is going to be a continuation. And it's not just a hypothetical. I mean, so the questions that come in is, on the moon, one of the resources that is crucial for maintaining a base would be water, liquid water. I mean, so water is really crucial because it's very heavy. And so taking it to the moon, actually, that is one of the biggest impediments to a certain degree. But if you can find local water, then you are relatively okay. And water was discovered to a certain degree unexpectedly in I think 2008, 2009, and it was an Indian satellite that actually discovered it, and they found water on the South Pole in the craters which remain permanently shadowed. So the sun doesn't directly shine over there, and so you have ice water there. Wow. And that has changed the dynamics, because that means that water can be extracted. So now the question is how much water there is, and it looks like there is sufficient water there. And so that leads to the fact that the next few missions, even for satellite missions, they are actually looking, and rover missions, they are all focusing on the South Pole, because that is going to be the likely place where there is going to be a lunar base. But that is not just for the US, right? So if the US has a base over there, the same place, the same location, the lunar South Pole, is going to be coveted by China as well, right?
Yeah.
And so now we are getting into this territory where you do have a resource, and forget about some other thing that may or may not be useful, like helium-3 or some other material that we find that can be useful for other explorations. Water itself would be a limited resource. South Pole is going to be the key place that it is there. And you are going to have multiple nations or private corporations getting down over there. So what the US is doing right now is, so it has created this Artemis Accord, in which it is asking other countries to join in. And I think right now the current total is 21, I think, which includes countries like small, like Luxembourg, United Arab Emirates, and others, but also I think several European countries are also there, and so on and so forth, Canada. And it also wants to get five, I remember recently, like African countries, it also wants to sign in.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is, it is trying to establish a protocol, because you do need a protocol in order to deal with these things. And people have to agree on certain parameters, which we all agree on, right? Like, we all say, okay, so we think this is the framework we can set up or solve our disputes, right? Now, the challenge is going to be that this is being set up by the US, which actually in Artemis Accord, that loophole, the corporation extraction one, that is actually inherently part of that accord as well. So the countries are signing up with, of course, US is taking the lead. And of course, there is this element that is part of that. But the key country in it that is missing is China, right? I mean, you can have all these accords, but if China is not part of that, and China is going to be the other country, the big country that is going to be there, then what to do? And I think that is unclear. And with the adversarial stance, and I'm right now talking from the US perspective, because I'm in the US, you are in the US. So I'm talking about sort of like, from my government perspective, I think US has been, regarding space in particular, so NASA is prohibited from any kind of cooperation with China. This was passed in 2011 or so. China wanted to join the International Space Station in the aughts, but the US actually vetoed that, and they said they cannot. And so China actually made its own space station. And so my concern regarding that is, we may not have a joint framework to even have a conversation. So you can have Artemis Accord countries, and you may have countries that may side with China. And China says, so it is working with European Space Agency, it is also working with Russia, and it's saying, we are open to everyone, we are not excluding anyone. There's also a political dig, but they will also be establishing their own thing. So how is it going to get resolved? Now, there was a lunar treaty, a moon treaty of 1977, which was actually pretty good. It actually dealt with a lot of things. The only problem is that US never ratified it. That time, Soviet Union didn't join in. Basically, any country who actually has the capability of going to the moon has not ratified it. So how is 1977?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The Moon Treaty of 1977. Yeah. So now, in some sense, Artemis Accord is the way, at least how US is thinking it's going to behave. So they are setting up rules, setting up that they all agree on. And the language is lofty, which you would expect. I was recently at a conference, and I was at a panel on Artemis diplomacy. And sure enough, that it's all for peaceful purposes. Everybody sort of how to encourage cooperation and all so on and so forth. But Ahmed, that's what you were referring to. But what if things come in conflict? What is going to happen? And I don't know how that is going to take place if we already have an adversarial relations on Earth.
Yeah.
So if you are putting...
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo. Brought to you by Rokos. Thanks for listening.